Welcome everybody to a discussion today that we're going to have around the potential failure of IBM security models, and we're going to also introduce a few different ways that you can possibly fix those issues as well. My name is Robin Tatam. I am the Global Director of Security Technologies over here at HelpSystems. I am certainly somebody who's been around the platform for an extremely long time, and I've focused in security for about 15 years of my career, which has led to obviously a lot of interaction with different audit staff and security staff around the world. I'm also one of the IBM champions for Power and a subject matter expert for Common. So hopefully, as I guide you through here, if you have any questions, which you're certainly welcome to ask through the question panel, we'll be able to answer those for you. So I'm going to start with a brief history lesson because I think it's extremely relevant here when we talk about IBM security to understand how we got to the place that we currently live. My career started on the box personally in 1989. The AS400 had been around for a year prior to that, and I think many of us can relate to the type of technology we used back when those applications were brand new. In many instances, we used a terminal that looked much like this, often referred to as a dumb terminal. It was connected via a direct point-to-point connection using a black Twinax cable. It was a very straightforward environment. There was a brick off the back of the IBM or AS400 as it was back then that allowed 4 or 8 of those connections to come in, and then of course we had multiple of those bricks, and it was a very straightforward environment. Troubleshooting those connections typically involved unscrewing that Twinax cable, straightening out the 2 pins that were underneath, and then rescrewing the cable back in, and that would typically solve any network problems. Very straightforward, but of course very limiting. When we dealt with security, it was really not a thing that was discussed very often. Back in those days, I was in the development side of the house, and certainly our focus was more around bringing the application into the hands of the user and solving those business pain points, much more so than it ever was a consideration about who was looking at the data or potentially who was changing it. Back then, we didn't really consider that risk was high. We had no internet. We didn't even have a PC network for a number of those years. And we certainly didn't have much on the side of outside connectivity. If we did, again, it was a point-to-point type connection, perhaps a dial-up modem to a remote controller, but certainly nothing that would easily allow somebody from another place in the world to be able to connect in and potentially access our server and our database. Security was inherently there. It wasn't because we made a direct effort for that. It was the fact that to simplify the lives of our users, we built a menuing system. And what we discovered along the way was that menu security enabled us to control and corral our users pretty much 100%. There was no workaround to that initial menu when the user first signed in. Now, we may see a different menu depending on how we specified our sign-on criteria, or if we allowed the user to access a command line at the bottom of the menu. But for the most part, it was pretty straightforward. Speaking of that command line, as we will do a number of times today, that was something that could be removed from the screen. It could be hidden from the user's display, or any user that was given access to it physically could be controlled on a command basis as far as what they were able to type into that command line. The application layer as well was also a value add. When we signed in and we dropped into our order entry application or our financial application, typically it knew who we were and had its own controls that said which of the application functions we would have access to. Again, all of these things were controlling the user's functions without necessarily requiring that a user be set up deeply in the security infrastructure. I don't know about you, but those days certainly were simple, albeit somewhat limiting. I came across this, which I thought was interesting, of some periodical that was published back in the 80s that spoke to the fact that having a dumb terminal actually could be deemed as a lot of fun. In fact, there were people that put together a club that was really revolving around the idea that we had these non-programmable workstations, and perhaps not a club we might be proud to join today. There's a lot of things that we can do on the network and through the devices that we use that perhaps outweigh the capabilities, but it's always fun to look back at those times fondly and remember how excited we were about those types of technologies. But let's take a leap forward here. We're maybe not going to come all the way to current day, but we are going to come at least into the 2000s, because it was a very pivotal point for the AS400 back then, because one of the environmental considerations is that we were moving away from Twinax. We were now connecting via a network. The AS400 was really just one server in a more complex infrastructure. Most of these connections came over a TCP line, and we used RJ connections through switches and routers. And all of a sudden, there was just an explosion of the ways that we could connect and the technologies we could use to get into that network. This kind of bore the death of Twinax, and it also meant that we were opening the door to all kinds of technology potential. We had PCs on a desk that had tools like Excel and Crystal reports, and what we found quickly was that the AS400 didn't really speak well to those. There was no communication between them. So we had all these highly colorful applications, but the valued business data was inaccessible to them, and that caused a lot of frustration. And so a lot of us polled IBM and said, look, we need the system to be less proprietary. We need it to be more open, and we want to access that data through all these fancy tools so that we can make good business decisions in much more timely order. What we discovered, however, is that when IBM did that and we had access to these new devices, in many instances, the application and the security controls that we had leveraged up until that point continued to be in place. So while we went from those deep CRTs to the nice flat screen monitors that we still use today, we found that the screens often look the same and the user experience didn't really alter much. However, now that we get into the current day, what we see is that the factors that were really low risk factors or no risk factors back in the 80s suddenly now are high risk factors. Of course, we have the internet. We are connected invariably to a network. And even if we are not directly connecting our IBM I server to the internet, typically through that network, it's going to be able to reach that world and vice versa. Outside connectivity is just a given nowadays. Moving data, having users access and interact with your network and your IBM I server from home or from the road is something that most of us do literally every day. The security that we had relied on that was extremely effective previously is now nothing more than an implied layer. Menu security only is really truly effective for those users connecting through a green screen. The commands that we could potentially limit by removing the command line permission or visibility to the command line all of a sudden can be circumvented because there are other ways that a user can run commands on the server. And that application security layer doesn't help much either. It's only there and going to impose control over those users that are using the official interface in. But let's face it, if I'm trying to get into your system and I'm perhaps doing so without your permission, the chance of me using the approved application to do that is slim and none. So we're policing those that are probably behaving themselves and leaving the door potentially open to those that are not. Now, many of us have used the term data breach for years. We talk about the loss of data and how you guys should be concerned about the potential of your information being leaked or lost, stolen, or sold. But it's not just about data loss prevention. Security incidences can really encompass many more things than just the loss of data. We talk about, of course, damaged or corrupted data that's still in place. It's in your database, but if the numbers aren't valid or if the data is somehow corrupted, this is impacting your applications. Your business processes are not going to function, or they're certainly going to function in an impeded or inaccurate way. High availability won't necessarily help in these scenarios because The role of an HA application or a function is to ensure that the primary server is mirrored almost exactly into a backup scenario. So if there is a loss of power or a loss of hardware function, we can potentially role swap in an emergency case over to that backup machine. But if HA is ensuring that the backup looks just like the primary, and we go and damage or destroy the data in the primary, the HA actually is now part of the problem, not the solution, because it's going to mirror that database destruction over to the backup machine. Now we have the unexpected, if you will, scenario where the HA machine and the primary machine both die potentially at the same time. And that's a scenario that many of us haven't planned on. That server downtime is, of course, unplanned. Any technology outages that can be a result of a cyber attack or a security incident is certainly no less damaging just because it may not entail loss of data. When we talk about malware and ransomware, of course, this isn't really involving data leaving the organization. It's the fact that the server is down. We've had a number of cities impacted recently, very recently, in fact, whereby city services have been taken offline and utility billing wasn't possible, and other critical city services were unavailable. When we have those services offline, when we talk about things being taken out of service, it's impacting the bottom line of the organization. Whether you're a not-for-profit or whether you are a profit-centric service, we don't really expect or we don't desire those services be unavailable because that's impacting the organization in different ways. Likewise, if you sit and think to yourself, well, the data that you have is not much value to those outside the organization. And that's certainly a comment that I hear quite frequently. In fact, talking to an organization a few weeks ago, I did get the feedback that their data would, as they put it, be on the bargain table of the dark web. It was not of much value outside of the organization. But the reality is that we have to anticipate that a criminal won't know that fact. They've, in theory, already accessed the network and compromised the security controls that exist, if any, to discover the fact that the data isn't of much value. So in essence, the horse has already bolted before they realize that what they've gathered is not much financial gain to them. When we talk about cyber threats, not only with data loss, we have to consider that the origination of the threat could come from outside, but it can also come from inside. When we anticipate outsider threat, which is how most of us perceive cyber attacks, we can consider that there are a number of different sources of those. And I've listed a few of the most common here. We've got, of course, state-sponsored. 5 years ago, perhaps we wouldn't have put much attention to that, but definitely in recent years, this has become much more visible, whether it is criminal acts that are originating from state-sponsored actors in countries like North Korea. We have to recognize that there is absolutely possibility that somebody is out to get you, out to access your system, even if it's to determine what weaknesses you may have, and that's being sponsored by a government state. We, of course, have the potential of political. I don't just mean in the government sense, but political from the standpoint of we're trying to do damage to the organization here. Perhaps it's a disagreement with corporate policies or with the state of or position that an organization takes in different areas. And lastly, of course, we have criminal, where somebody is trying to obtain financial gain or personal gain by accessing your network and accessing your systems. On the insider side of the house, we also have 3 different primary threat matrix. We have accidental, pretty self-explanatory, somebody pressing the enter key that doesn't mean to. We also have malicious, where somebody is perhaps disgruntled or they are no longer an employee or they discover an open door that they think is potentially going to net them some easy gain. And then we have negligent, which is a little harder to define, but really in essence is listed as a user that is knowingly going against corporate policy, but they're doing it with the best of intentions. Perhaps I take a spreadsheet home on my laptop or on a device because I'm going to work that evening and try to get caught up. I know I'm going on vacation and I want to get ahead of my tasks. Really, this is against policy, but I'm not doing it with the intent of harming the organization. But if my laptop is lost or stolen, or my own home network is breached, or I drop the thumb drive on the way out to my car, it's no less damaging. If you're thinking to yourself, well, we don't worry too much about the outsider threat as it pertains to IBMI because we have a firewall, we have to consider that those types of technologies are not completely foolproof. There are many instances where somebody has been able to finagle their way through, usually because of misconfiguration of that firewall technology. Someone left the proverbial door open and somebody was able to penetrate their way through, or somebody had knowledge of the firewall configuration and is able to manipulate and access the server from that. And there's a very good example here of a situation that was unexpected, and even though they had the necessary controls in place, there was inside knowledge and misconfiguration at play that allowed a criminal to be able to get in. And in this case, it was a data breach, but could have done lots of other things as well. We have to recognize that people outside of the IBMI community do have visibility into this technology. We can't simply bury our head in the sand and think nobody knows this platform, nobody knows how we work on this machine, because that is absolutely not the case. There are publications out there that are intended in theory to educate the IBMI community, but in doing so, they explain where some of the vulnerabilities are, and it's an unfortunate byproduct of that. There's other documents that are designed explicitly to help people exploit an IBMI environment. And so we have to recognize that there is knowledge, and this server platform is integrated into enough Fortune 500 companies that it's definitely on the radar of criminals, because most of them know that there is valuable data stored there due to the types of application it serves. Again, from an insider perspective, we know that many issues are accidental. I could probably write a book on the examples that I have of users that were legitimately accessing the system and that they accidentally performed the wrong task or accessed the wrong library or function and caused a significant amount of damage. I'm not too proud to admit that I would probably write some of those articles about myself. I know that I've pressed the enter key in my career and suddenly looked at the machine and wished that it was not obeying what I'd asked it to do, whether it's bringing down the server, whether it's deleting or recompiling the wrong program. We've all done it, right? It's just the factor of human error. And so we have to recognize that. If you trust your users, which I'm sure you do, we have to, of course, acknowledge that it's not simply the idea that we don't trust our users, that there is a possibility that if we give them too much access, that they will take advantage of that, perhaps not deliberately, and cause issues to the organization. And let's face it, the business is bigger than any single user. With that being said, there are also many examples where an insider has deliberately gone out and performed tasks that were unapproved, whether that again was to gain financial benefit for themselves or for people they know, or to perhaps give themselves job security or act on revenge when they lose that job security. This is all very real. And so we have to take a similar stance with the security of our assets, regardless of whether we deem the threat to come from inside or outside. Of course, regulations are not kind of blind to this. We know that there are hundreds of different regulatory mandates around the world that are designed to ensure that our system is protected. And we also recognize that the insider threat is potentially impacting us from a best practices perspective as well. So even if you're not dealing with GDPR, Sarbanes-Oxley, or HIPAA, or any other regulations that you may see in your industry or in your country, there is still that factor of best practices. And the takeaway for all of them is that we have to do better. We have to establish base controls. In many instances, you'll hear a directive about hardening security. And there's no real legal definition of this, of course, and most regulations don't often spell it out in black and white detail, certainly to those of us that live in IBMI. However, we have to do our best to interpret that. And in doing so, what we've established is that there are numerous steps. And I've listed two primary ones here, which is to restrict interaction with the server so it's only done by administrative staff, in that we're restricting application function and database usage to those users that have a business need to know. Now, within each of these two primary steps, of course, we have a number of sub-steps, ranging from restricting commands, removing special authorities and command line permission, and of course, auditing the activities that are happening. Auditing is beneficial primarily if you also look at that audit data. So let that be a warning to you as well. We see a lot of people that are indeed auditing the server, but really pay no attention to the log that is being generated. On the database side, again, very similar. We want to remove unnecessary special authorities. No matter how much work you do with object level security, if you have all object, it all goes out the window. We need to make sure that we're securing objects so that users cannot look at data or even modify data without having permission to do so. Stripping command line away can be beneficial here as well. And then, of course, we still have to anticipate that there will be users that need to gain that type of permission back, be it a database administrator, be it a programmer or a system admin. There are going to be break glass situations where something is going to need to be fixed, and we have to ensure that users can perform those fixes. The trick is that we want to be able to do that in a safe and secure environment rather than the wild, wild west. Again, we want to audit now user activities and again, review those frequently, because that's our only way of knowing if something is happening on our system that we do not desire and certainly do not anticipate. At the end of the day, we have two primary objectives. One is to protect the server. The other is to protect the database, which we do via the control of command directives and via the ability for database tools to access the database and allow the user to gain visibility to our corporate data. Let's start with protecting the server itself. Now, one of my functions here at HelpSystems is to publish the IBM State of Security study every year. And one of the areas that I look at is how users connect into the system. And I've got some warnings for you. In many instances, it's extremely easy to do. This year, we had over 15 systems that were allowing a user to connect with using just a single character password. Now, we chuckle when we tell this story, but there were still systems that were doing it. And we all know that that's not best practices. We recognize that this is not secure, but we still do it. And in many instances, it's simply because we don't anticipate that anybody with a malintent would ever be inside our firewall. So we rely completely on that perimeter protection to ensure that nobody is doing damage to our eye. But what we're looking at here is oversight of the fact that maybe the user is already inside the network or they gain permission to get to the network. And all of a sudden now connecting to these corporate databases that are stored on IBM becomes a simple task. Permitting a number of attempts to occur before an action is taken is another solid aspect of IBM security, but in far too many instances, we see where the number of attempts allowed is far in excess of what should be permitted. Now, most regulations allow 3 to 5, and the good news is many of us are adhering to that. But here we had 10 systems that said, no, we're just gonna let you keep trying until you get in. Now, I would rather you would have some kind of higher limit if you're one of those that is constantly bugged by users who can't remember their password or that disables themselves. Having no limit at all doesn't stop a brute force attack, and that's certainly one of my primary concerns here. If you want to have a higher number of attempts allowed, that's much better than no max. But what we're simply saying is that if you're able to connect to the network, if you can ping the IBM server, there's a very good chance that we're going to allow you to get into the system. And even if you are one that is restricting to 3 to 5 attempts, recognize that most systems have a significant number of profiles with a password that matches the user ID, meaning that there's a good chance that within those first 3 to 5 attempts, somebody's going to guess the right answer. We also have to realize that in IBMI, this is more of a red flag, meaning that if a user does indeed disable themselves because they exceed the maximum attempts permitted, there is nothing in the operating system that prevents them from continuing to try blindly anyway. And that would be typical if there was a brute force attack. It just keeps on hammering its head against the wall. And so the fact that that's occurring is, again, something we want to know. And that audit function can tell us if we are indeed watching for it. I've mentioned commands a couple of times, and we need to understand who on your system can run those commands. Unbeknownst to a lot of people, there are actually multiple levels that come in to running a command, at least in a green screen world. I've listed them here. Number one, can the user see or access a command line on the screen? I've listed here that that's usually done through a menu. Possibly there's a function key they press in the application that drops them to a screen like work spool file that has a command line on it. So we have to recognize, can they visibly see that command line or get to one? Assuming that they can, we then have to factor in a profile attribute called limit capabilities. That controls whether the user can run commands on the command line. More importantly, it controls which commands can be run on the command line, because we also have another option here that I'll mention in just a moment. Does the user have any private or public permission to the command object itself? So some commands like power down sys, for example, are shipped to you from IBM with a public exclusion, meaning that you have to have explicit permission or all object in order to be able to use it. There's other commands, many other commands, that are not restricted even to the public. Commands like end subsystem or start SQL are all supplied as public star use. And so we have to recognize that command permission, while a layer, is often not restrictive. Number 4 says, is there any particular special authority in play? Is there a requirement for that command that a user carry a special authority? For example, that end subsystem command that I just mentioned, you have to have job control in order to be able to issue that command. If you're interested in the requirements for commands, just look at the help text for the command and it will spell out any special authority requirements. And then lastly, does the user have permission to affect or impact additional objects? Now, this is a little bit optional because not all commands impact other objects. But for commands like clear physical file member, for example, not only do you need to be able to issue the command, but you need to have permission to the file you're trying to clear. So that in this case would also be a factor. So it's important that we understand all 5 levels and how they interact with each other so that we can ensure that we have the correct level of control for the users with green screen access. I'm going to focus on the limit capability setting here a little bit because a lot of you are using that control, and I want you to be sure that you understand exactly how that works. First of all, the State of Security study teaches us that on average, every system has over 340 profiles on it that can run commands on a command line if they can access one. In other words, we're simply not restricting the user from being able to issue potentially server and database commands. Unfortunately, in many instances, even if you are using limit capabilities, there are possibilities that users can run commands in other places. There are PC facilities that got added by IBM back in the mid-2000s the mid-90s, when we started opening the TCP doors. And being able to run commands through these interfaces is in addition to the green screen, and in some instances, it doesn't always be restricted by the limit capabilities. Now, as far as that control is concerned, each profile has an attribute on it that indicates whether the user is limited in their capabilities or not. There are 3 settings there: yes, no, and partial. The partial is sometimes a little bit confusing, but think of that as being closer to no than it is to yes. And whether you're no or partial, you're able to potentially type commands on the command line. All commands on the machine have an attribute that is modifiable that tells the system whether a user that is limited that can issue a command, okay? Now, in this case, what we're able to do is interact those settings, meaning that it is possible to change a command that is not normally permissible so that it can indeed be run even by those users that are limited. The default for most commands is that it can't. Okay, so I would say be very cautious and restrictive about any changes you make there. But if you have a user that has unlimited capabilities simply because they run a work spool file, and you have that in enough volume, consider changing the work spool file command to allow it to be issued even by limited users, which then allows you to implement that restriction. Okay. Now again, warning, limit capabilities is not always validated by PC interfaces, meaning that even if a user is limited, there are certain interfaces that a user can go to that would still permit them to run commands. And so don't use that as our sole control. It's absolutely beneficial, and I encourage you to use it, but it is not 100% effective. And so we have to contemplate other ways to augment the limit capability attribute. Within the HelpSystems portfolio, we have Powertech Command Security. So wearing a commercial hat just for a second, I want to tell you about a product that is extremely popular and really, really novel in that it intercepts commands before they're executed. You can evaluate powerful conditional rules as part of that command being issued, and then depending on whether those conditions were deemed true or false, you can then perform a number of actions, including rejecting the command, sending an alert, overriding a runtime parameter on the command, and even changing to a different command itself. In other words, we're getting more granular control. Just because the operating system thinks it's okay to run a power down sys doesn't mean the business wants you doing it at 10 a.m. on a Monday morning. And so being able to oversee those commands in a more granular, common sense way is extremely beneficial, even if it's just to get notification of when a sensitive command has been issued. As part of that warning, we have to recognize, as I said, that limit capabilities is not always validated, but PC interfaces that can issue commands in some instances can be overseen by an exit program. That's a term I know many of you have heard. Some may not be familiar with, but the concept is that it's just a program. It's called an exit program because it plugs into an exit point, which is really just a hook in an existing application. In this case, the existing application is the operating system, and the OS gives the exit program the ability to return a pass-fail code back to tell the operating system whether it should process or reject the request. As I said, an exit program is registered to the exit point. It's called from the exit point anytime a particular situation is encountered. In the scenario we're talking about here, it's when a PC is connecting into the machine and sending a request. There's about 30 different doors that a user can leverage, ranging from command execution to FTP to ODBC. The function of the actual exit program itself depends entirely on what the exit programmer does within it. That could, in theory, include unauthorized acts. So we want to be careful if we do see that there are exit programs present to ensure that those exit programs are indeed authorized by the organization. Typically, as a security officer, I want two functions. One is to audit the PC request. This is partly because the operating system does a poor job at doing so. For example, there is no audit log for FTP file transfers. We also conceptually want the exit program to give us some type of access control. Controlling the access of users is beneficial because in many instances, object level security is not present. We haven't leveraged it and configured it correctly. And even if we have, we quickly discover that it doesn't differentiate between the different access methods that are available to our users, meaning that if we open the door to a green screen user, we've opened the door to that user also leveraging a PC function like FTP. Likewise, if we close one door, we close all doors, and that often is not beneficial to the business functions. So an exit program can give us that flexibility to be able to do it. Now, as critical as this capability is, and the fact that it's been around for about a quarter century, One would anticipate that most of you have that currently in place, but the state of IBM security is telling us a different story. When we look for one or more exit programs being present, telling us that the user at least has some knowledge of the topic and perhaps has downloaded a program or written one of their own, we still see that 71% of the servers fail that simple test. When we up the bar and say we want all of the different exit points covered, which is usually indicative of someone using a commercial exit program solution, then we see a whopping 92% of systems failing that test. Many people still remain unaware of that capability or think because they have a firewall that they simply don't need it. In many instances, there is also a misperception that menu security and command line restrictions will work in all interfaces. And we certainly have established that that's not the case. And invariably, and unfortunately, the end result of this is that we protect the system from an interface that is most likely going to be last on the list of those attacked, meaning that the green screen type interface is carefully patrolled, but all of the other doors that would allow certainly a criminal to come in are left unattended. The good news in all of this is that it's one of the easiest security vulnerabilities to address. Again, wearing a commercial hat just for a moment, Powertech's Exit Point Manager for IBM is a out-of-the-box exit program solution, meaning that all of the exit points get immediate coverage from an entire suite of exit programs. Through a rules engine, you can now define how you want the server to react to outbound and inbound requests from the network. We can decide if we want to audit those requests and build a visibility into an audit trail. We also can set that return code, meaning that we can define in the rules that a user is not permitted to use some of these interfaces. And even though they may carry a permission in IBM like all object or open public access, we can deflect the user request away, meaning that we're not going to risk somebody grabbing data off the machine unless that's part of their responsibility, and we're not going to allow those inbound server commands to operate again unless that is expected and anticipated. Let's switch gears here just for a moment. Let's talk a little bit about the database side of things. I know many of you have line of business applications on your server, and we need to ensure that the database is protected from both malintent and accidental damage. Again, these PC interfaces tend to circumvent the present controls, the application menus, the command line, and the application's own security aren't a factor when we make a direct database connection. Understanding the object level security is definitely recommended. It's considered the gold standard here, but there are definitely considerations that come into play. On the positive side, object level security is deeply ingrained within IBM and it's part of the OS. You don't have to purchase it. It's already there. It's not something a user can circumvent. If you say you're excluded from a file, you are excluded from that file through every single door. There are new tools present that were added in version 7.3 and enhanced in version 7.4 that are designed to assist in simplifying the task of implementing object level security. So if you're contemplating this task, but you're not yet at 7.3, but you could get there, I strongly encourage you to take that step. As far as disadvantages are concerned, we still have some pretty significant ones there. It's the fact that object level security today is rarely implemented. And when it is, it's done so half-heartedly and in many instances incorrectly. Object level security tends to be somewhat inflexible, as I mentioned before. You have an open door to all interfaces or you have a closed door to all interfaces. In many instances, we want to have discrepancies between them. It can be complicated if you have an existing application that's been around for many years and you want to retrofit the application to a more secure model. And that tends to be very intimidating to most people. And unfortunately, we're only afraid of one more thing beyond a data breach, and that is breaking an application that works perfectly well today. And so we tend to leave well alone. Now, I know for a fact that most of the databases are open. The reason I know that is under the state of IBM Security, we look at the public permissions, at least at the library level, and we see that in a whopping 91% of cases, we're not sitting in that ideal exclude scenario. Now, I do acknowledge that 4% of the libraries have authorization lists. I don't know if the authorization list is wide open or locked as tight as a drum. So we'll accept that there's a plus or minus 4% margin of error here, but at least in 85% of cases, the libraries are open simply because the user has credentials, or think of this, have obtained credentials. One of the first steps we want to consider is disallowing database commands from a native perspective. Now, I've mentioned command lines a few times, but there's a number of commands that we should consider that should be restricted. And in some instances, these commands are open to the public because the expectation by IBM is that the objects that they're going to interact with are controlled correctly. So it's okay for any user to start an interactive SQL environment, which is really scary because the expectation is that the files that they may view or change or delete the data within are controlled appropriately. But because we know that's not the case, these tools become extremely dangerous when they're in the wrong hands. Also, we have to acknowledge that database access has become very easy outside the eye. There's tools like Excel, as in Crystal Reports, like I mentioned, that used to require a master's degree in computer science to figure out, but over the years, those have become easier and easier to use to the point where in many instances, they're just point and click, which is fantastic if you're using that data legitimately. But from a security person's perspective, it's a bit of a nightmare because now we know that users can drag and drop and open files and close files, modify data through an application without potentially truly understanding the ramifications of what they're doing. Again, in this instance, exit programs can be a saving grace. They can reduce the risk because by overseeing those PC connections, we can ensure only the anticipated users are making the inroads into the database and that the requests are reasonable based on expectation. Now, the exit point solution from HelpSystems is known as Exit Point Manager. And we have 5 reasons here that we feel Exit Point Manager can be a significant help. I've got lots more reasons. I could spend half my day just talking about this, but I thought I'd zero in on at least the top 5 because these are probably the most relevant to you. Number 1 is that the configuration of Exit Point Manager as it comes from HelpSystems out of the box is to audit the user connections, but not to block any of them. Of course, it can do both of those things, and that's an important part of the configuration as we evolve it. But when we first start out, we don't know what that traffic is coming in and out because the operating system can't see it. So we certainly don't want to presume that things should be blocked. We don't want to break business applications. Without Exit Point Manager, unfortunately, there's no way to know what those things are coming from the network. So part of the configuration steps are to use that forensic capability within the software to tell us and educate us on what's happening so that we can then make business decisions about what should be rejected and what should be permitted. We're able to implement Exit Point Manager independently of the application, meaning that it is a quick win. Think of this as a transactional firewall. It sits around the system. Once the user has authenticated, we're going to just make sure that they're not abusing the privileges they've been given, especially important if they have privileges that exceed the requirements of the business. Exit Point Manager has both a green screen and a browser-based interface. So depending on whether you're of a generation like me that likes the green screen or a younger generation that prefers to work through mobile devices and work through a browser, we can handle both of those user communities. The browser interface here happens to be full integration with HelpSystems Insight tool. I'll talk about that in just a moment if you're not familiar with that capability. If you have good object level security, or you feel that you're going to get to a state of good object level security, Exit Point Manager still remains relevant, predominantly because it gives us flexibility that the operating system doesn't have, and it also allows us to audit those connections, an important area that is lacking in IBM I alone. Now, this is what Exit Point Manager looks like in the Insight user experience. It's a browser-based system. It is more than just this product. It is integrated with many different HelpSystems products. It also affords you to be able to deploy tools and manage the license keys in same way you do with an app store. So you can see what's installed, what's not installed, if there are updates available, and then just click on a button to install the update. It's a fantastic user environment. As an administrator, this is certainly different from the green screen tools that perhaps are causing many people to look at IBM I as outdated technology. And certainly I don't think any of your CIOs that look at applications like this can claim that this is 1980s technology. Best part of Insight is you can use it for free. So as long as you have the software that plugs in this case, Exit Point Manager, the integration into Exit Point Manager is a free enhancement to the environment. All right, let's talk a little bit about auditing of the system. The native activities can be audited through capabilities that exist in IBM I. That's just an intrinsic part of the operating system. Unfortunately, we see many people not using it, and certainly a lot of people not using it correctly, but the capability is there and it's easy to set up and correct if you're not doing it right today. So that's the good news. The bad news is there's an entire portion of the activities on your system that you are potentially blind to. So those PC connections coming in and out of the system, which are arguably the most risky types of functions that you will have, are completely invisible to the operating system. In order to gain those, you have to add an exit program. So in our case, we recommend Exit Point Manager to give visibility to both types of connections. We have both sides of the house now covered. The question then becomes simply, what do you want to do with that data? Unfortunately, for many shops, it sits in the audit journal and just rots and nobody ever looks at it. And so we want to make sure that you have visibility. Exit Point Manager can report on its events, but we have to be able to report on all of these different activities and potentially alert too, because if somebody is brute forcing their way against your FTP server, don't you want to know about that sooner rather than later? Reporting can be accomplished very easily through Compliance Monitor. In addition to Exit Point Manager being able to report natively on its own transactions, Compliance Monitor can report on both sides of the house, right? So it can see the network security and network transactions. It can also see the native activities as well. If you're interested in doing real-time alerting, we have a fantastic SIEM agent that allows us to integrate in real time the alerts that are happening from the audit journal. I'm excited to announce that there is a new version of this software available. So SIEM Agent for IBM I version 4 is now available for download. That enables you to monitor the IBM I Security Audit Journal. You can also monitor the Exit Point Manager, as I mentioned, in addition to Authority Broker, Command Security, and even your own applications through integration with journals and message queues. The output to SIEM Agent can now go to multiple locations concurrently. Most people send to a syslog server. So if you're using a tool like Logarithm or Splunk or ArcSight or QRadar, these tools can now receive these events natively from IBM I in a formatted, readable context. If you don't use those types of tools, we can also send to stream files in the IFS as well as message queues where they can be escalated by other tools. If you are interested from a SIEM perspective, but you don't currently have a SIEM, then there is an option still within HelpSystems to be able to accomplish that. Powertech Event Manager is a fantastic multi-platform SIEM tool that will communicate with SIEM Agent just like all the others and is able to interrogate the events, escalate the ones that are deemed of primary criticality, and bring them all to your attention. Now, there is a freemium version of Powertech Event Manager available. And what this means is that you can leverage a SIEM solution by purchasing or owning SIEM Agent at no additional charge. I do have some customers that use an enterprise SIEM, so why would they ever want Event Manager? Well, the best reason that I have come across is that in many instances, when somebody is using an enterprise SIEM, they are either costed to them based on the number of events, and they don't necessarily want a lot of noise coming at them from IBM I, Or the people that are monitoring their enterprise SIEM aren't as familiar with this type of technology. They don't know IBM and Power that well. So here we can implement Event Manager to receive the events in conjunction with the enterprise SIEM. But now the IBM admins have their own tool, they have their own visibility. And like I said, if you have the SIEM agent already to communicate with your enterprise SIEM, we can potentially implement Event Manager under the freemium model and monitor one of your partitions for free. Now, I've given you some ideas here of how to fix things as well as the risk that they are remediating, but for me, it all starts with a health exam. I don't go into surgery unless I know that I really need it. So one of the best things that you can do for your IBM is to take a free annual exam. This is something that we offer through HelpSystems. It is a no cost, no obligation function that leverages some Windows software that we allow you to download. You can use that for 7 days. And we also will sit down and review with you the findings. So we'll explain exactly what it means, answer any questions you have, and have some dialogue around things that perhaps the software can't look into that you perhaps have knowledge of. And so this is an entire conversation, and we do not only the tool usage, but also the conversation at no obligation and no charge. If you haven't run one of those this year, then I would encourage you to do it, and we can sign you up for that. It's a busy time of year, but we'd love to get you on the books. It's an important function that you should be doing each year, and we invite you to take advantage of this as an offering to the IBM community. Part of that exam includes looking to see if your network services are exposed or if there are exit programs currently in place. So as I was describing that conversation and you weren't really sure whether you had those exit programs or not, this will tell you in clear detail. This report is something that you can print and retain, share with people in your organization. It is entirely yours. If you'd like additional resources for education, this is the best book in the market. This was written by Carol Woodbury of HelpSystems. She's another IBM champion, and this is a very readable book. Make sure you get the second edition here with this color cover. It covers you through version 7.3 of the operating system, but the changes that were inherent in 7.4, not heavily influential. This book is still extremely valid today. Probably the best dollars you will ever spend if you have an interest in IBM security. Another resource amongst many on HelpSystems.com is the State of IBM Security Study. This is something we publish annually. You can download this and see how others are configuring their system to make sure you're following best practices, as well as get much more advice on common misconfiguration areas and things that can be done to mitigate it. Out of all of this, hopefully the message is that HelpSystems has invested extremely deeply in security on the Powersystems platform. And that's not just a software message. Certainly the Powertech software brand is recognized around the world, and that's something that I have the pleasure of working with every day. But it's also a message about understanding the OS. We want the operating system to be the foundation that holds everything up, and understanding that operating system is something that we do and do very well. That part of our business is represented by Carol Woodbury on the Powersystems server. We also have Pat Botts doing a lot of single sign-on initiatives. So this really is an easy conversation and very synergistic between service and software. As an organization, we do a lot outside of Power as well. A number of recent acquisitions have brought in names such as Fox Technologies, Core Security, and ClearSwift, giving us a very solid footprint globally in not only IBM security, but also in Windows, Linux, and AIX. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those now. Shoot those to me through the question panel. Otherwise, thank you for joining. I will hang out for a few minutes here. If you think of a question later, or if you'd like more information, feel free to go to helpsystems.com or send an email to info@helpsystems.com if you didn't grab my email from earlier. But I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter. You can find me there as well. I'm always happy to help and appreciate the business from our existing customers. If there's anything we can do to assist you, I'm always happy to facilitate that, and look forward to speaking with you in the future. Again, I'm going to hang out for a few minutes here. If you do have a question, feel free to fire that at me. Otherwise, have a fantastic remainder of your day.